Hi, this is Dr. Kate Isaac, and I'm here to give you an introduction to our fifth and final module. Before we begin discussion of this module's topic, Al-Qaeda and the landscape of terrorism in the past few years, I want to remind you where we are in our course and what we've covered already, so that we can apply the things we've learned in earlier sections of the course to our discussion in this module of Al-Qaeda. We used Module 1 to provide a broad overview of our work in terrorism studies and to explain a set of global trends and patterns in terrorism we've discovered through our work with the Global Terrorism Database. We used Module 2 to look at what drives individuals to join terrorist groups. We used Module 3 to provide a discussion of some of the things that may drive groups to use violence and some of the characteristics that distinguish violent groups from other groups that do not engage in violence. We used Module 4 to look at terrorist group operations, what our research has told us about trends and patterns in attacks, and what we know about the behaviors groups engage in order to make the attacks possible. And here we are in our fifth and final module, where we will take an in-depth look at Al-Qaeda and use Al-Qaeda to illustrate some of the concepts we've discussed in these earlier modules. In this module, we'll ask and answer a variety of questions about Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is likely the 21st century's most well-known terrorist group, and yet many people lack a firm grasp of the nature of Al-Qaeda as an organization and of its relationship to other groups and communities. In this final module, we will examine Al-Qaeda through political, theological, historical, and organizational perspectives to gain a multifaceted understanding of the organization. By approaching this topic through multiple lenses, we hope that you will be able to reflect on the various topics we have discussed over the duration of the course and consider how those discussions might help illuminate different aspects of this case study. In Mr. Braniff's short introductory lecture, he presents us with the reasons why he believes it is important that a student of global terrorism understand and be able to analyze Al-Qaeda. He'll talk about some basic trend data we have from the Global Terrorism Database that tells us that terrorism affects the Muslim world more than anywhere else, and that 6 of the deadliest groups in the world right now are part of what he'll call the global jihadist movement, at the center of which, he asserts, sits Al-Qaeda. He'll emphasize that it's important to look at terrorist groups not solely within individual vacuums, in which we might come to understand single groups in great depth, but only through their internal structures, such as a close analysis of their leaders, their members, and their tactics might accomplish. Instead, Mr. Braniff will emphasize that it is also important to understand individual groups, especially such a broadly networked group like Al-Qaeda, within a larger context of global jihadism. As a side note, this introductory video will also be an important one for those of you interested in and/or concerned about the way in which he uses the term jihad. He'll explain his use of the term, the derivations of his definition, and his choice to focus on the term global jihadism as a modern violent ideology specific to Al-Qaeda and its affiliates. Once he's defined the way in which he uses the word jihad within this set of videos, Mr. Braniff structures his case study around the concept of global jihadism and how Al-Qaeda fits within it and works to perpetuate it. He'll discuss the creation of an international anti-Soviet movement of Muslims, which focused on creating a communal narrative built on the concept of defensive jihad, a belief that if one's community is attacked, one should defend it. Mr. Braniff will discuss this international anti-Soviet jihad network as one that was able to build a communal narrative that argued that if any Muslim community was attacked, then all Muslims everywhere had a duty to fight back and defend the attacked community. This communal narrative thus became a mobilization and recruitment tool. As Mr. Braniff discusses this point, you might think back to our discussions of enabling or supporting behaviors in Module 4, particularly our discussion of terrorist propaganda and its role in the recruitment and capacity building processes. You might also think back to our discussions of ideology in Module 2, when we explored radicalization as a process or set of processes by which an individual comes to believe that violence is necessary in order to advance an ideological goal, and where we describe ideology as a set of beliefs that describes the way individuals or groups see the world around them. Returning to Mr. Braniff's introductory lecture, this historical context of militant, networked Islamist actors he describes for us, then, he argues, sets the scene for the creation of Al-Qaeda in 1988. And here, you might think back to our discussion of terrorist group networks in Module 3, One of your optional readings in this section of the course draws on that research on terrorist group networks and demonstrates al-Qaeda's centrality among a variety of highly networked groups. Once we see the historical context for the group's creation, Mr. Braniff will turn to the question of why al-Qaeda has had such longevity, a career approaching 30 years. Here, you might think back to our discussion of terrorist group organizational characteristics in Module 3, when we noted that most terrorist groups last less than a year, and that only about 20 groups have been active as long as 30 years. Mr. Braniff will argue that al-Qaeda has had such staying power because they have crafted what he calls a grand historical narrative for the group. In short, he'll discuss al-Qaeda's co-option of historical events to create something of an identity story, a historical narrative of Muslim grievances, and a narrative built on the idea that Muslim nations are at their strongest when Islam is the organizing principle for their societies. This narrative and its resonance for many people, he'll argue, has been key to the group's success and longevity. As you listen to this lecture, you might think back to Module 2's discussions of ideology, and specifically about the role of grievances, real or imagined wrongs, or feelings of unfair treatment, in the processes that drive individuals to join terrorist groups. In the next video, Mr. Braniff will discuss what he calls al-Qaeda's theological context. In this video, he will explain where al-Qaeda falls in the landscape of violent jihadism, which he'll explain as just a small part of the larger landscape of political Islamism. He'll then explain Islamism as just a part of the even larger landscape of Sunni Islam. And he'll finally explain Sunnism as just one part of the still larger landscape of Islam. He'll argue that we can understand al-Qaeda's work as an effort to create a fundamentalist interpretation of Sunni Islam as the political law of the land, and that we should understand al-Qaeda as sitting on the very periphery of Islam. His discussion of al-Qaeda's political goals might encourage you to think back to Module 4, when we discussed the 5 primary goals of terrorist groups. In fact, we might see elements of several of these broad goals in Mr. Braniff's discussion of al-Qaeda, including in particular regime change, territorial control, and social change. In the next video, Mr. Braniff will further delve into Islamism as a political ideology, painting us a picture of a modern political ideology that places Islam as the primary form of governance in a political community. He'll then break this concept down into types of actors who support Islamism, including missionary activists, political activists, and violent activists, which is the category into which al-Qaeda falls. He'll further discuss al-Qaeda's strategic orientation, referring back to our discussions in Module 4 about the 5 basic terrorist strategies, and placing al-Qaeda within the attrition category, a strategy in which terrorist groups engage in long and drawn-out tactical campaigns aimed at slowly decreasing the will of a government challenging them. He'll also provide some discussion of how al-Qaeda uniquely approaches the goal of attrition on a global scale, doing violence themselves, but also working to reorient the violence of other groups by convincing those other groups to commit violence in service of its own cause. Again here, you might think back to Module 3's discussions of terrorist group networks and terrorist group cooperation and collaboration. In the final video, Mr. Braniff will build on his discussion of al-Qaeda's global networks by expounding on the group's social and electronic media usage. Key to the group's identity as a central node within a global jihadist network, he'll tell us, is their ability to communicate to a geographically diverse audience. In this discussion, he'll introduce us to al-Qaeda's media organization, As-Sahab. In so doing, he builds specifically on our discussion of al-Qaeda's online magazine Inspire from Module 4, and also provides a larger context for some of the optional readings we offered to you at the same time on terrorist use of social and electronic media, such as YouTube, Ask.fm, and Twitter. Once Mr. Braniff concludes his discussion of al-Qaeda, Dr. Lafree will return to wrap up the course with a look at trends in worldwide terrorist attacks in 2013. This video will provide analyses of statistical data from the Global Terrorism Database from 2013, which is the most recent data the GTD team has been able to collect and prepare for public access. We place this video as the conclusion to our course for 3 reasons. First, we think the trends represented in these data help to reinforce Mr. Braniff's arguments for why we chose to focus the final course module on al-Qaeda. Dr. Lafree will demonstrate the dominance of al-Qaeda-affiliated and al-Qaeda-inspired groups, showing that of the 10 groups committing the highest number of attacks in 2013, 6, the Taliban, al-Qaeda in Iraq or the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, Boko Haram, al-Shabaab, the Pakistani Taliban, and al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, are all al-Qaeda affiliated. He'll argue specifically that the 2013 data demonstrate the growing importance of groups affiliated with al-Qaeda. Dr. Lafree will also show us that the GTD recorded more terrorist attacks in 2013 than in any other year on record, with a 40% increase from 2012. Thereby underlying the ongoing global salience of terrorism and the ongoing importance of studying terrorism so that we might make reasoned and thoughtful decisions related to the phenomenon. This point brings us to the second reason we are choosing to end the course with a lecture from Dr. Lafree using GTD data. His discussion focuses on the newest year of GTD data collection. All previous trends and patterns discussed in relation to GTD data in this course have relied on data from 1970 to 2012. While we have not yet been able to integrate our 2013 analyses into the larger time frame, we do believe that 2013's data demonstrate consistency with the patterns that we were identifying at the end of the 1970 to 2012 time frame. We hope the findings from 2013 will help to validate the findings related to patterns in recent years. And finally, we hope this final video provides you with an important bookend to where we started in the course. Module 1, where we argued for the importance of working with empirical data in analyzing terrorism. We introduced you to the GTD at the very beginning of the course, with Dr. Lafree's lectures on the 9 myths about terrorism. And we close here with the GTD as well, because this data set is one of START's foundational research projects and one of the primary services that we as an organization provide to terrorism analysts and counterterrorism practitioners. As such, we hope that this final lecture from Dr. Lafree will provide some symmetry to the course and leave you looking outwards, towards thinking about some of the implications of the things you have learned here, and how you will use your new knowledge, founded in the empirical study of terrorism, to improve the world around you.